My girlfriend, 28F, tends to quote entire interactions, which tires me out listening. We have been together for about 3 years now. We barely argue about things, and if we do, we resolve it quite quickly. It's also good to know that we tend to do our thing during the day, and if we want to spend time together, we tell the other. I'd like some advice on the following. My girlfriend spends a lot of time on her studies, which go great. She made some good friends so far, and has a lot of fun. All good. It's good to know that she is on the autistic spectrum. However, I've noticed a quirks which I have trouble dealing with. Sometimes weird things happen, which she finds funny. She wants to share the funny interaction with me, which I appreciate. However, to get the fun part across, she tends to want to describe and quote everything in severe detail. During the day I tend to listen a lot for my job, and I find long-winded stories draining to listen to. Especially if the story is meant to bring a point across, and it keeps on going to add more to the situation. I've tried before to explain that I have trouble to keep paying attention. She didn't take it too well, but she did appreciate me being honest with her. Over the past few months she has gone back into this habit. What is a good way to handle this? Girlfriend elaborates a lot on her stories and tends to quote every sentence on what happened. It's a very tiring listening experience for me. What can I do to handle this better? Now for the top comments. Things that work on my mother. Ask for the punchline at the beginning of the story. Then when you feel like she is going off track, you can ask her what this has to do with the ending to get her more on topic. If Tiffany yelled at her boss today, I'm still going to know why she did it and how it happened. Another tactic you can use whether you know the ending or not is to stop her when she starts getting long-winded and summarize what she said for clarification. Then ask her what happened next. So, Tiffany was minding her own business in the break room when her boss came in upset? Then what happened? It shows you are actively listening and are enthusiastic about the next part. If she starts going into too much descriptive detail, you can pause her and say that the scene is set, she's got it. Got it, it's in the conference room by the microwave. A couple of other good phrases are, this is taking away from your story, will I still understand the rest if it isn't 100% perfect, yeah I know how person place thing can be. I don't need to know all of this to get the idea. The important thing is to always be positive when you interject, like you are really excited to see what happened instead of just trying to get her to shut up. I'm also a big fan of summarizing the story back to the person at the end of the conversation, again all in the form of a question. It helps you learn where you need to start interjecting and teaches them what you consider to be the important parts of the story. Then you get to also add lines like I know from previous stories that this, whatever, takes me out of the story, so can we skip past it? Next comment. Something like this: hey GF, we have different communication styles and needs. I love your stories and I want to hear about your day. I think it is amazing how much detail you always remember, and I think retelling is part of how you process information. Better yet, ask her if it is. Sometimes, when I am drained from a long day, I am not able to process all the information you share. I tend to need recovery time. Is there a short sentence we can come up with that I can say so that you don't feel like I am shutting you down, but you know it is hard for me to take in a full detailed story, and a better time for you to abbreviate what you are sharing? Realize that what she is doing is pretty native to people on the spectrum, and does feel to them like sharing and processing, so the habit is never going to fully go away. So many undiagnosed or later in life diagnosed non-neurotypical women are used to being snapped or yelled at for most of childhood for not behaving properly. ADHD same. I have been on both ends of this ADHD, and found I appreciate, and it has been appreciated, if the formula that's used for misunderstanding is gently explaining and framing it exactly that way. Hey, you have a unique brain, I appreciate, but this is how my brain works. Then be very clear and specific what your needs are. There will be chronic relapses, but the less anger or stress used to explain the need, the easier it is to accommodate and improve over time. Edit saw another comment. I believe her that it is difficult to edit info down. That is something she can work on with support, but she may not want to. Code word or sentence then needs to be that the longer stories go in the box, to be shared at a later moment when you have decompressed, and you can listen. Next comment. My partner has ADHD, and I am awaiting an autism diagnosis. She loves to tell stories in full detail, but I also get lost in the details and zone into something she said that's totally unrelated to the punchline. She's a creative storyteller, but also has some trauma around not being heard as a child, which I think is related to how she tells stories. She usually asks me if I'm open to listening before she starts sharing, which helps a lot, especially if my mind is already racing with thoughts. My part in this has been to learn to pause and be more present and patient with listening to her stories in the same way she offers her time to me when I ramble about things that don't always make sense. We have time apart each day, and we have weekly check-ins where we can bring up things too, so we're not constantly switched on to one another. Perhaps you can reflect on these things, or try them with your partner and yourself. Next comment. During a couples retreat I went to with my husband before we got married, we did Myers-Briggs and a couple other communication style tests. I can't remember if it was part of Myers-Briggs or one of the others, but as part of it my husband and learned a similar issue we have is due to our different commutation styles. I am a detail-oriented person, so I also tell long-winded, overly detailed stories. Conversely, he tells modified, sometimes embellished stories. He is bothered by my unnecessary details, and I'm bothered by his inaccuracies. Understanding how these differences fit in with our personalities and seeing how we both were annoyed with similar but opposite problems really helped me be less annoyed with his stories. Doing something like that might help you as well. I know my stories are too long, and I do my best to try to curb the details, but it's who I am and part of how I communicate. If he brought it up multiple times and made me feel like I couldn't tell him about funny things that happened to me during the day, our relationship would have suffered. I think this is something you need to figure out how to handle rather than trying to change your partner. Possibly asking her to tell you stories later in the evening, so you have some time to decompress after work and refresh a bit before listening would help. Next comment. My best friend does this too, and sometimes I'm totally fine listening to the whole back and forth, but other times I'm exhausted, and my brain is filled with my own, and I have very little attention span. I started to get restless and anxious when listening to a really detailed story sometimes. It's hardest in the mornings when I first wake up or right when he gets home from work and comes in hot after I have been quietly alone working from home all day. I've talked to my therapist about it, and for the aforementioned examples it has to do with transitions from one type of energy environment to another. I understand not wanting to offend your so, especially if they're sensitive about it. I don't like making my partner feel bad about his communication style or long-winded explanations of his interests, because he gets embarrassed and down on himself easily. I try and focus on grounding myself in the transitional times and making it clear when I'm not in the headspace, or need a little time to adjust when waking up or when he first gets home. I also try and make it clear that it's my emotional state or energy level that's affecting my capacity to listen, not something he's doing wrong. I have had a hard time expressing how I'm feeling in the past when I'm overwhelmed or anxious, and would end up being irritable or spacey, so now I just try and be really honest when I don't have the capacity for something. Next comment. Try discussing it with her during a time that she's not sharing one of these detailed stories. Tell her you love her, that you enjoy listening to her and knowing the details of her life, and that sometimes, or even most of the time, you don't need all the background to understand the story. You can ask her to give you the bullet points of the story, and that if you require further clarification, you'll request it. The important thing is that you show her that you value her and appreciate the care that she puts into relating these stories to you. Show her that you love that she's sharing these things with you, and explain that the way your mind works makes it so that you actually understand and enjoy the story more when there is less detail. I am dyslexic. Long, involved stories exhaust me, lose me, and confuse me. Fast facts that aren't related to each other trip me up and take hours to actually register in my mind. During arguments with my ex, she'd bring up point after point, often unrelated, doing her best to upset me, prove me wrong, convince me I was toxic. She's abusive and toxic, it was all projection, but I digress. After my diagnosis of dyslexia, I discovered that one major issue was that I was not processing her points at the speed at which she brought them up, but was instead processing slowly, one at a time. For example, she could say, "You think I'm abusive? You are abusive because you keep telling me I'm abusive," probably because she broke my nose, and that's mental abuse. followed by "I can't believe you'd tell your sister about the time I went to jail." With a quick thrown in and "Yeah, you're right, I shouldn't have blocked you all day yesterday, and I'm sorry," which would have been what the fight was about in the first place. The way I would process it, however, was more like this: her, "You think I'm abusive?" Me thinking, "Yes, that's why there's blood streaming down my face." Me talking, "I can't even believe that's a question." The subsequent points would be lost until far later, when I'd eventually say, "I don't understand why you're bringing up so many unrelated things when all I wanted was to know why you blocked me all day yesterday. I didn't even start an argument, it was just a question." At which point she'd tell me she had already admitted she shouldn't have done it, and had apologized, which I literally couldn't remember until hours later, as the altercation would set in my mind a little at a time. I started to stop my ex during arguments, which was very difficult to do. I would tell her, "I know that we are in disagreement right now, and I am not trying to ignore the points you are making. Right now, you are saying a lot, and the only thing that has registered in my mind is the first thing you said, so I really need a bit of time to let the rest set in my mind so that I can accurately respond to or agree with the things you are saying. I'm not ignoring you or trying to discount what you're saying, I simply don't process things as quickly as you're bringing them up." Following that, our fights became far less disjointed and were resolved much more quickly. My point in giving this extreme example is that your girlfriend has one way of communicating and you have another. These differences can be easily overcome by first showing that you value her method of communication, and then informing her as to the most effective manner to communicate with you. Next comment. It's a thing. I do it myself, Asperger's, or whatever we're calling it now. It tends to happen when we're really seeking approval or validation for a situation with someone we see as being normal. You'd really be surprised how much social interaction scares us that we did something wrong in a situation, but most people on the spectrum don't like to be told we were wrong, go figure. A lot of time the anger or frustration edits sick when we've demonstrated a non-socially acceptable behavior, and it's pointed out, such as going into too much detail, is directed inward, which then outwardly boils to the surface as being pissed off at the world. Just trying to give you some background so you understand the actual internal struggle that's probably taking place, though I've never interacted with her, so I can't state that as a fact for her, as we're all a bit different in our quirks. Chances are if in interactions with her family the fact she never shuts up is brought up, then my statement's probably true. As in how to handle it really comes down to your dynamic. Obviously you two give each other space, as that's another thing we deal with, the mind being so jumbled that another human creates a distraction where our minds go to mush at it, which then results in more frustration. But in moments like this, like I said, the validation aspect is what's really occurring. As much as it sucks, listening and being made to feel that what they experienced is important to you too, may be the only true way to assuage her need to overshare, because if the validation is given enough times, and they know or are made to feel that their judgment in that situation is sound, then she won't need to seek it as often. This typically comes into play in my relationships when I've started to feel something slipping or missing, but I've been at this long enough to begin to self-identify and channel it elsewhere, like external hands-on projects that give me a sense of accomplishment, but women inherently have a nurturing and social aspect about them that this may be harder to escape for her. I may get wasted by the community over this one, as I know all of my statements weren't politically correct and made some broad sweeping assumptions, but I think you know her better than anyone besides maybe her family, so you can make an accurate assessment as to what I've said. Asterisk edited for some attempt at clarity, and a comma here, and there really makes a difference.